Anyway, speaking of remarkable, I'm going to introduce Mr. Pat Phillips, who has been a master of many endeavors. I'll leave it at that. So he's a private pilot, or was a private pilot, still flies, I know he does. Did you know he was a poet? And he could, in all modesty, tell you about a few of his poems. I don't think he will, but that's okay. Did you know he was an actor? And it appears on the X-Files. I think he was the X in the X-Files. He's an X-actor. He's also was the first president of the BC Aviation Museum. He was also the first president of the Catalina Preservation Society. So if anybody's got a society out there, you're starting out, Pat says he's available. So there you go, Pat. Thank you. Oh, I better start.
Anyway, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you tonight about the history of this place and how it all came together.
There you go.
It's a story I did about maybe 11 or years ago. I think I did it for one of the luncheons here, but a lot of those people I think have probably left the planet by now. 32 years ago I was standing in that doorway with Jim McLaren, the guy who built this place, and that's why there's a name out there. It says McLaren Airways, if you ever wondered what that sign was for. And Jim and I were discussing at that point, when this was just a frame and a gravel floor, whether we should bring water across from the washrooms into this area. And I would say it's probably lucky we did, so you get to drink some of Doug's so-called coffee. He asked me a few months ago if I would do a speech for him or a talk for him, and on the early days of the museum and the acquisition of some of the early collection, and thought it would be good before they sent me to the home, because it is getting 74. I'm running out of time, so it's a great story. I'm going to try and tell you as well as I can remember it. Like I said, it was 30 years ago, but as Doug says, you never let truth get in the way of a good story. So most of this is probably true. I feel a little inadequate standing up here tonight when you consider last month they had a U.S. Navy carrier pilot with 4,000 landings, 2,000 overnight. He had video with it, mind you. The time before that was a Vulcan pilot. The time before that was the guy who wrote the book on the Canadian Dam Busters, and the guy before that was the engineer who pioneered the fuel system on the Concorde. And you kind of say, what am I doing up here? What have I ever done? But anyway, that was my impersonation of it. But so to get going, oh yeah, Doug also said not to spend the whole time on the speech because probably nobody was going to show up anyway. But see, look at that. Although I didn't build this place myself, there were some long nights where I certainly felt alone. But Norm Dressler's not here tonight, but Norm did come over on a couple of weekends. And Grant back there was here every day after play school, so we've had that going. Yeah. I don't see Steve Butler tonight, is he here? No, I thought maybe some of the guys might be. There's very few of us that were around. Anyway, there was about 6 people involved with the building of this place, actually. Anyway, this airport was built in 1939, as probably most of you know, and later became part of the Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which trained over 300,000 aircrew, sent them overseas. I think it was something like 50,000 of them didn't come home. And it's a privilege to be involved with an organization like that we provided a venue, at least in some way, to remember some of those sacrifices. And I think Doug deserves a vote of thanks for his research that he did on this memorial that was built on Hospital Hill. Originally, they only had about 60 or 65 names on that list of people that were killed here during training, and by the time Doug got finished with his people in the library, they had a total of 180 names on that memorial. So Doug should be thanked for that. I appreciate it.
The library group.
The library group, yeah. So, not to be outdone by the U.S. Navy with their video and carrier landings, I am going to give you some motion pictures in color of Pat Bay in 1944. And you're going to see something you've probably never seen, a flying Bolingbroke. And the reason, The reason that these movies exist is there was a rule or a law passed in the late 30s that if you were going to distribute Hollywood movies in the Commonwealth, you needed to make a certain amount of movies in the Commonwealth countries. So, hence, there was two made at Pat Bay, one in 42 called Commando Strike at Dawn with Paul Muni. They used Phillips arm as a Norwegian fjord, and they built a village down there. And in 44, they came here and they filmed Son of Lassie, which was, the dog was called Laddie, starring Peter Lawford, very young Peter Lawford, June Lockhart, and Donald Crisp. We couldn't get the sound for some reason off the DVD, but we do have, so I'm gonna let this just run. You're gonna see the P-40s, you're gonna see Bolingbroke's flying, it's just marvelous. So here we go. Maybe. Oh, it worked. Now you'll look at the back, there's Mount Tuam, Salt Spring. This is the West Camp. There's a Boley warming up, P-40 going by. There's a couple of Venturas in the background. Now they're going off on a mission. That's Peter Locker, I think. There we go, taxiing. Look at it, actually moves. It's really an airplane, after all. Actually, the Bolingbroke was the fastest airplane in the world when it was designed in Britain. It was actually called the Blenheim over there, along those Blenheim. Anyway, here's Laddie chasing after the hero. This is runway 09, or 08 then. There we go. So there's 4 Bolingbrokes in the air, can you believe that? And then of course, on the way back, one of them shot down in the movie and he has to bail out, and the 3 of them coming back. And Doug and I figured the director said do something neat. So there's one guy in the back. He's a little off center. So I guess that's it.
No. Big spot frame.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to get a movie to run on the DVD or the stem sometimes.
It's an old computer.
It's an old computer.
We need a new computer.
There are the lads. Again, Mount Tuam. You know, hasn't changed much. Yeah. And these are the ladies, of course. We have to have ladies. Yeah, so that was, I saw this on a news clip 10 years ago and I couldn't figure out where was it. And there's the West Camp, the RCAF base. I think that's your hangar, Bruce.
Yeah, great.
So anyway, they came up here and they filmed this movie, and there we are. I think they must still have that tugger on this area. Looks like Bob's tug. Is Bob here? No, Bob's not here. Right there. Yeah, that should be about the end right there. Yeah. You know what I'm supposed to do next? Oh, here we go. Okay. And this was a squadron reunion in 44 of 111 or 122, I can't remember. There's Lassie right down in the middle, or Laddie, and that was the squadron.
122.
122 squadron. And this is a shot when they're filming. That's the camera guy beside you on the right. Commando Strike at Dawn, they dolled up a couple of Lysanders and put German crosses on them, so that's filmed in that same area. They didn't do any flying. Anyway, this is where the museum kind of starts. The roots of this place are in World War II, and they really start with George Maude. A lot of you probably knew George. George was a young man, I don't know, he's probably in his teens, and that's George right there in that boat going out to pick up a PBY crew. Obviously, they used to anchor them out in the bay on mooring buoys. And he also used to do the refueling out there with the PBYs. This is a shot of Mill Bay in 1940 something. There's about 5 or 6 of them out there, and then it's probably a total of 30. And Bob Dick's airplane is probably in that collection somewhere. So when we were painting, just to show you what kind of a historian George Maude was, when we were painting this aircraft for Bob a couple of years ago, and putting the blisters back on and restoring it back to its RCAF heritage, that airplane actually flew out of this airport in 1943. And Bob brought it home, and it's a long story, and that's another night. But anyway, when we got to the point where we had to put the deckling on, somebody showed up in Vancouver, Dave Scott actually is his name. His father, Edward Scott, had actually flown 11024 during the war and had passed away earlier that year. And he wanted to do something for his dad, so he owns a graphics company in Vancouver that does fire trucks and decorations and all that stuff. So he researched and manufactured all the deckling on this aircraft. It's all to scale, it's all the right color. He did all the historical stuff. And when we got to this big letter on the tail, George was telling us the reason those big tail letters are on these airplanes, when he used to go out to refuel these things, there'd be 20 of them sitting out on mooring buoys. And the serial numbers are really quite small, 1124, you can't really see it from the beach. So they'd say, go out and fuel whatever number, and you'd have to go to 5 planes till you found the right one. So they decided to put a big letter on the tail. So Bob said, well, what was the letter, to George Maude, what was the letter on the tail? And George says, I got a picture of every PBY on this airport except for yours. But he said, hang on a second, this is not bullshit. George went down to his house, half an hour later, down at Pat Bay. He's back with a crumpled up piece of foolscap, which we have a copy of now. And on that list was all the PBYs that flew out of Pat Bay, and 11024 had the letter K after it. So that's where K comes from. So that's the kind of a historian George was even at that time. So after the war, of course, during the war, George was also crew on the Huron. This is the crash boat. And he had some pretty horrendous stories, and we won't go into it, but there was a lot of crashes out here, and guys coming in at night with Catalinas or Cansos and using flare pots and flipping them over, and he pulled a few bodies out of the water. It was pretty sad stuff. That's George on the right. I found that picture, lower right. That's the Marine Division of Pat Bay. So after the war, there was a big garage sale here, and they were selling off planes, engines, you name it. And George bought this P-40 for $50, and an extra engine for $10, and put it on a raft and took it to Salt Spring. Can you imagine? That airplane's probably worth $1.5 million to $2 million today. So he left that over. He also bought 2 bowling ropes for $35 a piece. One of them he donated to the National Museum, which is still there. It was in good shape. And the other one he took to Salt Spring, and I think Grant was telling me earlier today that they split the fuselage on the back of that one and made it into a chicken roof, cap for a chicken house, roof for a chicken house. And it sat there for years. George used to, people on Salt Spring will tell you a story about this. George used to fire this thing up about every 2 weeks with a barrel of gas. I mean, you could hear it 5 miles away. So anyway, there's the bowling rope that we have here. Now, George continued to, after the war, continued to be a collector. This was a Hamden crash up in can't think of the name of the mountains in Salt Spring. So he collected that. This blast tube that's out here by the memorial room was stuck in a tree. That's from V-24 that crashed, and he couldn't get the blast tube out of the tree, so he cut the tree down and brought the log home. And that was sat around for a long time. So about this time, I kind of got involved. I was with BC Telephone Company, and they assigned me the airport in the Gulf Islands. We used to call it the Dream District. And I came out here to become the area telephone repairman installer. So I got to know all the tenants on the airport and the workings of the airport. And one day they sent me out to a place called One Air, which was a flying school charter company across the way. And the guy that ran the place, I was there for about a month putting the system in, is sitting right here tonight, Bruce Corll, a very close friend of mine today. And Bruce talked me into taking a familiarization flight. And I went and got a license, and the rest is history. I mean, here we are standing 30 years later, all because of him. So I thank him for that, for the gift of wings and then talking me into it. One day I was driving around the airport, I came by Mills Road and I saw this shack here. And there was a couple of kids working on it. And one of them was in the back, Grant Hopkins back there, and David Maude, George's son, of course, and Warren Freeman, another guy from BC Tel, was there. And they were collecting up a bunch of stuff, and they were trying to get a museum going. And at that time, they called it the Canadian Military Museum, and they had to change it to the Commonwealth Military Aviation, CMA meant Commonwealth Military Aviation Museum. There is the bowling brook. The one that was on Salt Spring was pretty carved up, so we found somebody in, I don't know how we got a hold of this guy, but this is a farmer in Winnipeg donated this, and CP donated the hopper car to bring it out here. They actually brought the hopper car all over to Victoria, and they offloaded it. We also got the nose with it, was pretty shot up and really dirty and full of a lot of bird shit, so we took it to the car wash. That was my idea, I think, or maybe Grant's. That Jeep, by the way, was donated by Flint Motors in Sydney, so we got that. Here's some of the shots, early shots. That's the center section from Salt Spring, I think. And this is kind of the restoration underway, just before we painted it. Okay, so that was pretty much how the bones of it started. They had, that time when I was talking to them over there, they said that they had written letters to John Crosby in Ottawa about getting a lease on the airport, getting a museum started. There was another group out here called the Naval Aviation Preservation Group, another one called the Canadian Aero Foundation, and I think Canadian Museum of Flight in Vancouver had a chapter over here. Everybody was kind of vying for this idea to put a museum here. And at the time, and Norm explained this all to me, it's all very convoluted, but Norm Dresser, of course, is one of the original members. He's not here tonight, I don't think. But Norm was vice president of the Flying Club. The Flying Club was being evicted because they were going to redo the tower or something, so they were looking for a place to live. And they were looking at the Nicholson building over there, which at that time was the Trident Aircraft Company, that big thing that was a big frumpy deal. So they were trying to get that, and they thought, well, we'll get involved, and then we'll both go in there. And so there was some talk about that, and that didn't happen. And then Expo 86 was coming to an end, and there was a bunch of pavilions, and there was some talk about getting 4 or 5 of these and bolting them all together, and that would become the museum building. And then the engineers who were involved says, no, they never were designed to last more than 6 months or a year anyway, so you can't have those. So it was decided that we would get a grant from the government on the Expo Legacy grant. And Hugh Curtis, who was Dave Curtis's father, Dave's the president of Viking. Hugh Curtis was finance minister. He invited us to a meeting. We put it together at the Flying Club. And he told me, he said, you get all these groups together and come back and see me and I'll talk to one person. Okay, I don't want a whole bunch of people. So we did that. We had this meeting at the Flying Club. This was very, very key because all the stars were starting to line up for this thing. And it was agreed that the Naval Aviation Group pulled out. I don't know what they were up to. They had no airplanes anyway. The Canadian Aero Foundation had 1 plane, I think. He was the on the Flying Club board. Eric Cole became the engineer for this building. Jim McLaren was there, who was their treasurer, and Norm Dresser, of course, was the vice president. And it was decided at that point that we would get a grant, and they would give us this Expo Legacy grant, and the lease was kind of in flux at that time. Pat Crofton, luckily, who was a friend of the Mods family, I think they named it after Crofton's named after the Crofton family. They're from Salt Spring. He was the Minister of National Defense in Ottawa and our MP for this area. Mel Cuvalier, who had just taken over as finance minister by the time the sod turning, he liked airplanes a lot. Mel was a great guy. By the way, that's a digitally enhanced version of me right there. So anyway, the long story short is that we got the grant. They sent a guy out here from Ottawa, Dan Gallagher, from the National Museum to vet me, I think, because I was president of the new organization, which we had decided to call the BC Aviation Museum. And that was a 2-year deal, by the way. Getting British Columbia in front of your name is impossible without ministerial approval, and you have to go through a whole bunch of it. So they were keeping their eye on us. And they sent this Dan Gallagher out. We went for lunch, and he spent about 2 or 3 hours with me. And I remember the quote he said, and this is 30 years ago. He says, so are you just going to get a bunch of military junk and load it up and put it in a building like the rest of them? And I said, no. I said, the plan is to try and focus on BC aviation history. That's what our focus is. But the military stuff is more available, let's face it. He says, no, I understand that. But he liked whatever I told him, I guess. But so between him and Crofton and whoever else was involved, Crosby, the lease was granted. The quick story on the lease, Jerry Baker was the airport manager. He called me up one day and said, meet me over by Mary's, and he walked me up to where the dip goes in the road as you come in. There was no road into here. And he said, what do you think of this? And I said, no, we want to be over on Mills Road. He says, well, you're not going to get Mills Road because North Saanich doesn't want to develop that at this time. So I think you should take this spot, take a look around. There's the terminal's right there. He said, you've got Willingdon Road over there, good visibility. And I said, well, yeah, there's no road. He says, well, that's your problem. Yeah. So they gave us 7 acres. We had all the land from the creek all the way out to the runway, and then from the creek all the way over to the ditch here. So So to make a long story short again, we went and got a culvert. We bought a culvert with the last of our money, and Dave Dennis trucking came over with his excavator and installed it for us, trucked in some sand, and we got our road. Hence, we got a sod turn. And that was the very beginning of the whole thing. Now, everybody's happy now. Look at that. Okay, so there's the first official building in the BC Aviation Museum. That was the dentist, that's the dentist shack from the Royal Canadian Air Force Base. And we managed to save it, and we dragged it across the runway, and it's still sitting over there. I'm still not sure what we're going to do with it, or what you're going to do with it, but let me just get myself caught up to the slides here. So we got the lease, and while I was out on the lease one day, and I was standing there just trying to think about what we were going to do. And I only met Jim McLaren for maybe 5 minutes at that meeting, or half an hour, but I only said 3 words to him. He came up to me and he said, so who's going to build this place for me? And I said, I haven't got a clue. I said, I don't know. Obviously, you're going to buy a building, I guess. And he says, anybody getting paid? And I says, no, nobody's getting paid. It's all volunteer. He says, I'll build it for you. And he walked away. And Jimmy spent the next 2 years, every weekend, on this property with us. Digging gravel, putting in drain tiles. You name it, McLaren was there. And he was still developing buildings all over the city in his companies, you know. So Jimmy really pulled it all together. I mean, talk about having the right people in the right place at the right time. Steve Butler showed up on the scene. He's not here tonight. Steve sold us the building at cost. And so we got the building delivered. He came up on a truck. And this is just for Connie. Before you do anything on this airport, you have to have what they call a FAP, a Facility Alteration Permit. So we had the land, we had the grant. I'm not even sure if we'd ordered the building, may have. And it dragged on and it dragged on and it dragged on. And I came down here one Saturday to do the usual cut the grass or something, what we were doing here. And there was an excavator working out of the property, just like that one. And I drove by and I parked and I walked and I saw it was Steve Butler, and he was, you know, dirt and all this dirt. And over by the museum, where the museum is today, there was a trench all the way out to the button of 31, the runway out here. And there's this blue pipe laying there, and I'm figuring, what the hell's going on? You know, there's actually the CRD was building the water line at exactly the same time, coming the other direction across the front. That's why we have a hydrant out here, by the way. So I go out to the end of this trench, and Jim McLaren is down in this hole, at least 8 feet down, I swear, 8 feet down on the ground. It stunk so bad, you know, it was just terrible. He busted a hole into the sewer pipe, the main sewer for the airport, or opened it, and was clamping on our sewer system. That's what he was doing. And I said, what are you doing down there? He says, I'm hooking up the sewer. I said, well, we don't have a out of hell with the reports, or the permits. He says, I'm doing this. So I said, well, what's the tower going to say? And he had a backhoe, and the light was turning and everything. And he's, like I said, he's sitting right at the button of 31. He says, they think I'm working on the new water line. I said, you told him that? I said, yeah. And I said, well, what's Butler doing? He says, he's doing a soil test. I said, a soil test? Christ, he's got 2 acres of land ripped up. He says, it's a big soil test. So, I swear, that's a true story. Anyway, the building arrived. There's the building, came up on a truck. Once again, I say today, the driver says, where's the check? I had him the check, 50,000, whatever it was. And he says, this isn't any good, it's not certified. I says, well, what do you mean it's no good? It's the bank. And he says, nope, it's got to be certified. So he's not going to unload the building. So it looks like we had a little bit of a relationship with Coast Capital because my wife worked there. And I got over there and banged on the door of the city at about 20 to 9. And banks don't open their doors for nobody unless you're an employee. But anyway, I got in, the bank manager certified the check, ran back over here, gave it to the guy, and he unloaded the building, and he buggered off to catch the ferry. So there was the building sitting there, and this was February of '87, I guess. Now, the next picture, this is a little bit of a side, like these little side stories. The big fellow in the front is Jack Ferguson. We called him Judge Jack. He was a retired judge. He had come over a couple of days ahead of this building arriving, and said he wanted to help, be part of the museum. And I didn't know at the time, but Jack had flown Wellingtons in the operations. And he said, whatever I can do would be great. And I swear, about a week or a day after the building arrived, the Ayatollah raised his ugly head, And I think it was the Iran hostage, I'm not sure, but they raised every airport in Canada to a Class 1 security. You guys remember this. They had guys going around spraying the weeds along the bottom of the chain link because the terrorists might, sneak in. They took all the shrubbery out of Great Creek, took it all out of both sides of the airport. There wasn't a tree standing anywhere. And the next thing was that they were told that we could not have the gate open without a watch, without a gate guardian every time we opened the gate. Well, we've got trucks coming in doing excavators, gravel hauling, all that stuff. So I talked to Jack. I says, would you mind standing as the gate guardian while we get this thing built? He says, nope, no problem at all. So Jimmy pulled his trailer out from home. That's Jim McLaren, by the way, in the middle. Brought out his house trailer, and Jack stood in that house trailer through the whole 8 months of rain, snow, and all the rest of it, and every day, and he was here, and we got it built. I should say, again, about Jim, if Jim hadn't, well, he came up to me at one point when we got the building up, started to have it up. He says, you haven't got enough room. I said, well, what do you mean? It's 150 by 100. He said, no, but you've got no place for offices, gift shop. Where are you going to put the bathrooms, I mean, we wouldn't have a room if it hadn't been for him. So I call it the annexes. Now this is the original building here, and this is the annex, what you're sitting in right now. This is all wood frame up here. Now we got extra metal from the company that supplied the building and covered it all, and gave us another 5,000 square feet, I think it was. But it was $60,000. He lent us the money. He says, I'll pay for it and set it up later, figure it out. He wanted to get this thing built, just like everybody else. So Norm reminded me, and I don't remember this, but everybody on the board had a co-sign loan for $10,000 until we got the next draw, because you get these grants don't come all at once. You get a little bit, 60,000, and then we ran out of money and we borrowed money until we got the next draw. It was pretty. I never told my wife about that. There's a picture of the building on it with Jim and his 172 a day, and we took some shots. This is the flying fireman right here. Bob Dick probably flew one of those planes. There's the bowling grove sitting there. And that's how wet it was. It was the wettest year in history, of course. There's the annexes as they're being constructed and filled in. This is George Maude right over here. Christ George was in his 70s then. He worked on it every day. This was putting the spin on. Now, this is what goes on in politics. And as president, of course, I have to do the politicking part. I had a good relationship with Mel Cuvelier, and luckily in this particular riding, they had two cabinet ministers out here. Terry Huberts was Minister of Municipal Affairs on the left, and Mel Cuvelier was Minister of Finance. And Mel liked airplanes, and he was impressed with what we had accomplished at this time. When he turned this on, he thought it was great that we were doing it. He said, I'll be behind you any way I can. So whenever we had a check presentation, we always bring the big check and the cameras, right? Because it's always an opportunity. So on this is, I think, the second draw. I said to McLaren, make sure you skin the front of the building, okay? I want the building all skinned to the front and the door in when Mel gets here. Because he was always impressed if you could stretch a buck. So he showed up and he says, Jesus, I can't believe you got this thing up. I said, well, Mel, we're trying to stretch the buck like you said, And he walked through, and this is what he saw. And he says, Jesus Christ, it's all phony. It's just like Hollywood. He laughed like hell. Anyway, so that was we call it the Eastern Front. This is Doug's humor, the Eastern Front, because we're on the other one. Okay, so we get to this point. The building's going along fine. This is 1987. And we're out of money as usual. One of the other things that happened when we started to build this building, by the way, was the Save-On food building collapsed in Vancouver, and they doubled the requirement for all the steel in every building that was going up or going to be constructed. So we went another 20,000 in the hole for the additional re-rods that hold these footings together. They went from 3/4 to 1.5 inches, and they're 150 feet long, and it just went on and on and on. More concrete. So that was one thing that screwed us up. The other thing that was interesting was we had no power here. There was no electricity, right? But there's an old power line sitting out there with 3 poles on it, came as far as the creek. Somebody said it belonged to BCBC. I went over to the guy at BCBC at the government hangar, told him, what are you going to do with that? He says, we don't need it anymore because they rerouted everything underground. So we got the power line is our property. Now, everybody else has been tapping off it for years. We should be charging them for aerial trespass, actually. So Mark Twalmley, I knew him as well. He's an electrical guy. Came out with his truck, set a couple of new poles, rebuilt the power line. Wasn't cheap, but he built it and donated a bunch of his time and became the electrician for the whole project. Again, another guy stepped up to the plate. Jim McCaddy, who also worked at BCAM, who owns McCaddy Trucking and the McCaddy's gravel pit, donated a lot of his trucking, hauling the gravel in. I mean, there's thousands of yards of gravel in the base of this place, some of the concrete. So we had some help. So we get to the point where we got no more money. There's no more money to do anything else. I mean, the building's coming along, but there was a group that tried to get an air show going in '86 called Airfair '86, and it was okay. And we decided to have a proper air show, and the Air Show Society formed the society, and the museum was to be the charity for the air show. And it was going to be an annual thing. We'd run an air show every year, and that would be our funding. Made sense. I mean, lots of other places do that. I got appointed air show coordinator for the air show. It's another whole night speech. But to make a long story short on this one, 35,000 people showed up. It was the longest traffic jam in Pat Bay history. I told the police that I went to the Bill Semien, the guy who used to tow the banners around, him and I went down to the ICAS convention, International Council of Air Shows. You have to have credentials before you can have an air show, or Transport Canada won't even talk to you. So we did all of that. And they said, well, how many can we expect? And the guy down there that ran the Tampa Bay Air Show, he says, how many people you got within 50 miles? I said, well, probably 300,000. And he said, well, you probably get 10%. And he was right on the money. 35,000 people showed up. We made 30 grand, 35 grand. I talked the board into giving us 10,000, 5,000 to buy the Norseman, and 5,000 to go up and get it. So that's where the money came from to get the Norseman. There's a couple of interesting stories about this, and like I said, it's another evening talk, but I was in my telephone truck one day driving around the airport, and the show was to be on the Monday, the long weekend, August the 3rd, and I had a phone call on the radio, I had a handheld from the tower, and it's Peter Parsons, and he says, I got a KC-135 on 10-mile final, where do you want to put him? I said, he's not coming till Saturday. He says, I got a KC-135 on 10-mile final, where do you want to put him? Put him in front of the government hangar. So the KC-135 landed. We had the customs lady rushed over. We had to kind of use the government hangars as the pilot's area for deplaning all these speed, but they're all early. He was really early. And it was a colonel that was driving this thing, and he says, I'm really sorry we kind of snuck up on you, but we flew all night to get our missions out of the way, and we're more than happy to pay for the extra hotel rooms. But I said, no, that's okay, Colonel. You just take it easy. Do you want us to do any appearances, go to any high school? He says, no, you're good. You just fly the airplane on Monday, and I'll be happy. He says, I understand your ticket sales haven't been too good. I said, well, you know, it's like everything else. He says, tell you what, we'll help you sell some tickets, okay? And there's 14 guys on this crate. So I said, well, you know, that's nice, but you don't have to do that. We got lots of help. He says, no, you don't understand. We'll fly the airplane tomorrow. So they came in at 7 o'clock, pre-flighted this thing. Asked me to go along, but I couldn't go because I had to go to an MOT meeting, and they took off. And apparently, I haven't just told this secondhand, they went down Dallas Road at about 400 feet with the probe hanging up the back. Yeah, no kidding. And flew all the way around Vancouver Island, went over every major city. They were gone for 3.5 hours. And we had another 10,000 tickets sold by that night between them. And the other quick story was, another Ayatollah story. We had an F-14 to come to this air show, and it was going to do the demonstration, right? He's the demonstration pilot. And Top Gun had just come out. Everybody was in love with Tom Cruise at F-14, so I got this airplane lined up to come. And the Ayatollah did his thing, and they scrambled the whole Miramar squadron from San Diego, sent them all to the East Coast. Lost the F-15 Eagle, lost the KC-10, and the F-14 Tomcat. So, and I just finished doing a show on Joe Easingwood, telling everybody to come and see the Top Gun airplane will be at the air show and we'll fly. So we got a disaster. This is Saturday afternoon. John Addison, who happened to be my air operations guy, and you probably heard John Addison's name mentioned at the Vulcan guy's story. He was the co-pilot in that particular Vulcan accident. John flew the Vulcan to Abbotsford, actually. When anybody saw the Vulcan, that was John Addison flying. Anyway, John was retired, he was managing the flying club, I think. But anyway, he was doing the air ops, and he calls me up and he says, I got a phone call from a guy on an aircraft carrier, and an F-14 wants to come to the air show. So what had happened when we were at ICAS, Obi Phillips, who founded the Snowbirds, told me to look up this commander down there in the Navy, who has an old buddy. He was an old buddy that flew in the Blue Angels with him, and he was hooked up with the Secretary of the Navy. And when I told him who I was and I had come down and Obi said to say hi, he said, okay, you get whatever you need. I'll send out all the notices to all the bases so they can make their own deals. So this F-14 driver sitting on this carrier sees this teletype, says Victoria's cleared for an air show. So I get a phone call, like John, he says, can he come? He just has to be guaranteed a hotel room. I said, just tell him to come. So I think he was here like in 3 hours. Supersonic, he said, burned everything he had. And when he came in, Parsons is in the tower, and I said, there's an F-14 coming. He said, yeah, we heard all about it. He said, don't worry, but we'll look after him. So they gave him like 15 minutes to land. So it took him all the way around the peninsula and up and down the city, because he wasn't allowed to fly the air show. So we got away with it. And the last thing that Addison did was when the Harriers came, they said they needed 120 gallons of #1 distilled water, because that's what they inject into their engines when they're hovering and to the demonstrations. Addison, we called it the A-Team. He disappears in a pickup truck, comes back an hour later with 120 gallons of #1 distilled. They robbed every lab in ocean sciences. So, we got the money. There was the air show. 35,000 people showed up. There's the KC-10. There's the crowd. There's the Ray-Ban Golds. The big crowds. This is the F-16. He did a great demonstration. I told him not to fly over the racetrack, but there's a horse still running apparently after his. There's the F-14. And a shot of Bob Singleton. It was a great day. So we got the 30,000 or the 10,000 for the Norseman. Mel Price, that's his airplane out there, that Fleet 2. Actually, I think the oldest aircraft in British Columbia, when he either donated or sold it to the Royal BC Museum. Mel was an AME. Him and I were going to go up and get this Norseman. Because I knew the people on the airport, already the tenants, I got tickets from PWA and from Time Air to get to Vancouver and get up to Terrace. It cost us $600, so we took an Otter. This guy had a lot of fun, this pilot. I got to ride in the right seat because I was a pilot. And we flew all the way up and over the ice and that through peaks. It was just a incredible trip. And we landed in a place called Johnny Mountain, which is a molybdenum mine. And it's on top of a 7,000-foot mountain, and you land uphill on this granite thing and you go down the other side. That was pretty exciting. These guys got out, and we took off again. And as we took off and we were starting down the other side, I said, well, this is pretty hairy. And he says, oh, you should see the Hercs that come in here. They bring Hercules in there. And they bring this molybdenum ore out. He says they go flying off the end of that. They don't use JADO. They just dive into the valley and build up airspeed. And he says it takes them about a half an hour to climb up. And he says it's pretty impressive flying. So we're making the approach. This is Bronson Creek where the Norseman crashed. It looks like a riverbed where I was anyway. And as we're coming in on the approach, you can kind of see the Norseman. It's hard to see. It's right there. And at the very end up there is a Beech 18 sitting on its belly. And I said, what happened to him? He says, well, he came in a little hot yesterday and ripped his wheels off, so they're fixing him. And then the Norseman's lying on one side, and then the engine's on the other side. And this guy says to me, if I blow this landing, you might as well start your museum right here. That was the funny quote for the day. Yeah. And when he hit, I tell you, the rocks were flying up and hitting the wings, I swear to God. So we get there, and this is what we bought. Looked pretty rough. Pay attention to this hole in the side. There's a story about this. Anyway, that's what we got. Now, there's Mel. That's the engine on the other side of the runway. What happened is they forgot to put the wheel nut on, or something on the left wheel came off when the guy was landing. The wheel fell off, flipped on its back. They were flying out of Wrangell, Alaska, about 50 miles away. We were right on the panhandle of Alaska and BC. And it was full of diesel. It was carrying diesel in a bladder, so the whole airplane was soaked in diesel. So everything came apart really easy. So that was a nice part. Again, my digital self. The reason there's a bunch of this hole, when the insurance adjuster came down from Wrangell to wherever to adjust the accident, they have a lot of bears in this part of the country. A bear came out and came after him, actually. They got some big black bears. So he got inside the airplane, and the bear started ripping the fabric off the side of the airplane. And the guy was screaming his head off, and they came out. I don't know if they shot that particular bear. They had shot one the day before doing something else. or scared it away. So that was the story of the insurance adjuster. I asked somebody before I left, how much does a wing weigh on an oarsman? And somebody said about 300 pounds. Oh, there's no problem. Yeah, are you kidding? Try 800 maybe. We had to use a battery. Luckily, this guy came over after work. Now remember, it doesn't get dark till 11 o'clock up there, so we worked till midnight the first night. This is the second day, I think. This is Rick Gilchrist. He actually learned to fly at Vancouver Island helicopters. He did the first lift, took us out, took the engine out. The first lift. It was about 30 miles to the Bobkin Highways Yard, Department of Highways. Another friend of mine happened to be the Deputy Minister of Highways. He set it up that we could get a low bed to take, their low bed to take the whole thing down to Langley if we could get it as far as the Bobkin Highways Yard. So now remember, I've only got $4,000 in my money belt, and I've already burned up 6 getting up there on the Otter. Anyway, we got this hauled out. Beautiful flight. This is the last day. I wasn't there when they picked it up. I think that's a 206. I'm not sure. We had everything jammed inside that plane. And there's the Bobkin Yard. And there it is arriving from the ferry. Now, when I got back down here, a guy named, I can't remember his first name, Mike Trucking out of Arrington, calls me and says, I'd like to help you out. I'll bring my truck down and go over and get that airplane for you. So he picked me up. That's me in the front seat with him. We went over to Langley, picked up the Norseman, brought it back. I phoned Bruce Kirkpatrick, another great story. And they came out and had the cameras ready, and I thought, well, this is going to be a death-defying crew from the BC Aviation Museum, rescues Norseman, Blackbeard, the whole thing. You know what the headline said? Bare mangled Norseman arrives at BC Museum. Museum personnel went up and got it. I don't know what the hell they said, never mentioned this. There it is there. There was one little story I forgot to tell you because I'm not using my notes, but I'm winging it a bit, pardon the pun. Jack Ferguson, I said, was a Wellington driver, a Wellington pilot, and he brought his logbook in one day, and he said, I spent my 19th birthday in Claresholm, Alberta, my 20th birthday in London, and 21, 22, and 23 in Stalag 3. I said, you mean the Great Escape? He said, yep. I said, how'd you manage that? He says, well, we were over the Ruhr Valley, got shot up with Ack-Ack, plane's on fire, told the boys to get out, stuck with it to the last minute, it was too late to jump, so I rode it in, broke his back, broke his leg. Had a picture of the German guy who was hired to guard his airplane, or the soldier. A couple of people from a house close by pulled him out of the wreck. The Germans took care of him, and they ended up in Stalag 3. On the back page of every one of these diaries, these guys were sent to the Red Cross sent, every POW got a journal book of blank pages and they could use it for diaries. And everybody had one of these in the camp, and Jack had his back page, and on the back page was 50 names, all very carefully written out with their squadron ranks. And those were the 50 guys they machine gunned in the movie. And everybody in that camp was told to put that list of names, and then one of those books would survive and they would get the bastard someday, and that was what that was about. He didn't work on the tunnel that they used, but he worked on Harry, so he talked about that a little bit too. So another one of these press gambits that I'm trying to do, if you have an event, I learned early, you can find, if you get, get an event going, you can get a little publicity. So I phoned up Bruce Kirkpatrick, who said, anytime you've got a human interest story, give me a call. So I said, well, come on out, the museum's looking good, we're putting the new doors on. And so he came out with the crew, and I happened to mention that Jack had spent some time in Stalag 3. Well, they talked to me for about 10 minutes, and then they went to see Jack. Well, they were there for like an hour and a half. So the 6 o'clock news comes on, I go home to watch myself on TV. I'm not really that much of a ham, but I wanted to see what it looked like, and if we got the information and the message across, and how much money we needed. And it opened with Steve McQueen riding his motorcycle down the side of the bloody fence. And then it cut to the clink and the boys in the camp. And anyway, the whole story was about Jack. And at the end, it was about 10 seconds on a bit of me and a bit of the door, and that was it. So anyway, but Jack was a great guy. There's the Norseman going together. It actually ended up being two airplanes. Apparently, the frame that we brought back was too badly bent, according to Neil, so he had a buddy with another one. And you, of course, have seen the finished version, and there it is flying, I think 10 years ago. We haven't flown it since. So, we'll take a break, if you want. Let's see, yeah, it's pretty close. And it was a hell of a ride, it was a hell of a trip. We wanted a Norseman because it was the bush plane of BC, that's what we thought. I'm going to talk a little bit about Walter Clayton, but I'll leave it till the end. Walter Clayton was the chief designer for the Lordine Aircraft Company, and Walter Clayton showed up in this museum just before we opened it, so I'll tell you that after the break. That's a little teaser. You could read it. And I see it's still sitting there. And you know, you read all your years of watching the Red Baron and the Max, Blue Max, and what it would be like. Well, you read Victor Pauline's diary and you realize how boring it was most of the time. They were always having problems with weather, especially in France. He was always losing an engine. He landed on beaches. He came home in the back of farm trucks. It was just... And then every once in a while there'd be a little thing at the bottom of the page say, Prescott missing, Smith killed after tea. Like no emotion, nothing at all. So, you know, pretty good. He's doing well. He's mixing it up with some German albatrosses, and, you know, he's in the battle. And then on the next page one day I'm reading, and I swear it says, Richthofen shot down today about 5 miles from here, going over after tea to have a look at the aircraft. That says it right in there. You can read it. He's not making this up. The next day, and it matches up with history, went to Richthofen's funeral, full battle honors, full military honors given for the Red Baron. About 5 or 6 pages later, it says, they gave me a sop with a dolphin to fly. Don't like it, tricky. 3 days later, he does a test on this thing, having engine problems, carburetor problems, and I think 3 or 4 days later is an entry. It says, Pauline killed on takeoff today, stalled or whatever, in this aircraft that he didn't like, and that was the end of Victor Pauline. But anyway, it's very touching, and to see this thing with the Red Baron, to actually see in front of me a guy who was at the funeral, it just blows you away where some of this stuff comes from. Just a couple of the things that we got initially. This is a Pete and Paul built by a BC Tel guy that I knew, and he lost his medical on the taxiing. He couldn't fly it, but he got it taxiing. And this was built out of a model, Mechanics Illustrated from the 1930s. It's got a Model A engine in it. That's why that big radiator is in front of you. It kind of lousy vision. So they donated that to us. This is another digitally enhanced version of me right there. This is the job track program. We got a job track program from the government. I won't get into how we got it, but we ended up with 35 people here that were on welfare and 160,000 bucks grant to look after them for 6 months. David got paid actually to supervise them. I had to go and rent 2 hangars plus a building over on McDonald Park. But they actually built the Gibson. Some of them were pretty talented people. They did that. They built the 985 cutaway, the radial. They did that, and they did a bunch of skin work on the bowling rope. I went down to the Royal Museum and asked them if they wanted to have Bill Gibson's airplane in the museum, so we had it in there for 6 months, which was pretty neat. I thought it was a heck of a good display. Got a call one night, 10 o'clock at night, from Rankin Inlet, Northwest Territories. The guy said, I got a plane here that was the government's first aircraft, BC government. I said, oh really? He says, yeah. And then we had a hangar fire and it got cooked, so you want it? I said, well, it's going to be a little tricky pulling it down there from Rankin Inlet. No, he says, we'll fly it out there. And he said, I said, how can you fly it? He says, well, we can't use it commercial anymore, but it'll still fly. So they put a new windshield on the pilot side. The other part's all bubbled up from the fire. And this kid shows up 4 days later, I swear, taxis in this airplane with a handheld radio. And he's about 25 years old. And he gassed up in Winnipeg and came straight through. It's pretty fast, this thing. It's got turbines on it. And he said it was really interesting over the Rockies. He said the wingtips and all the plastic stuff was falling off of it. But anyway, the deal was they wanted the cores for the engines back, so they came out the week after. They did something, left the props on there, and away they went. This is actually a Beech 18. And Huey Thomas, who used to be the government engineer, the story was that Flying Phil Gallardi, you remember that name from British Columbia history? Well, this was Phil's airplane, and the story was Phil wanted a King Air, and they couldn't afford it, so Huey built him one. So this is a trade wind modification. They put a single tail on it, tricycle gear, and PT6 turbines in it. Apparently it moved along pretty good. Jack, what's his name? He's the pilot all the time. Jack, yeah. Big Neil. One of my last airplanes that was donated when I was still here was, I was working at Vancouver Island Helicopters. I had a good relationship with most of the people on the airport. And they were all basically behind what we were trying to do here. I mean, it wasn't a big secret. Everybody wanted it to happen. And Mr. Norrie, who owns the company, called me into his office and he said, how's the museum going? I gave him the usual story. And he says, my brother and I were talking and we think we'd like to donate our aircraft to the BC Aviation Museum. So that's how we got the CB. Now, I think Norm flew this for a few years, sponsored it and flew it. It was flyable. And it's kind of neat because that's the first airplane that I ever flew. It flew in. I was 3 years old in 1948. My parents bought property on South Pender Island, and the only way in was by plane, and we flew in one of these things. And I still remember the waves coming over the top of this thing. Now, this is a guy named Jim Wardrop. I mentioned earlier that, you know, we were kind of under the microscope in downtown, and I'm not blowing my own horn, but Jim Wardrop was the guy that collected all the stuff at Expo 86. He bought the Beatles car. That's where he was. He was the collections manager for the whole province of British Columbia. They were keeping a pretty good eye on what we were doing, and he said, you're getting a reputation in this town of the guy who gets things done, so I'm out here to give you a hand. And we had talked about the helicopter in the Royal BC Museum. This is the first helicopter in BC. This is Okanagan's first aircraft, Bell 247. That was in their collection. And Mel's airplane out front, the fleet, was also hanging up in the museum. Jim Wardrop was basically instrumental in both of those aircraft coming out to the museum because we had become credible enough to receive the artifact. They knew we'd look after them. And of course, by then we had been officially given the British Columbia designation, so we were the BC Aviation Museum. And Jim and I had many lunches together. We talked about the A-26. There was one left at Con Air. Les Kerr, who apparently is a member of this museum, I met him here one night. He was the president of Con Air. He donated half a dozen of these, or 3 or 4 of them, to different museums, and they immediately sold them to the States and turned them back into military stuff, and he was very unhappy about that. So Jim says, if you want Tanker 22, you better go over and talk to Les. So he went with me, and they knew each other, and walked into Les's office with Jim, and he said, so if I give you my airplane, what are you going to do with it? And I said, well, we've always wanted a water bomber at the BC Aviation Museum, and he says, we don't drop water in this country. And Jim gave me the old elbow. I said, that was good, you know. Anyway, I said, I'll tell you what. I said, he's going to put it, I heard you're going to put a new paint job on it. And he said, that's right. I said, well, you put a new paint job on it and deliver it at the air show that I'm coordinating on August the 3rd in front of 50,000 people. How's that sound? And he missed it by 2 weeks. But the airplane did arrive. And according to Doug, this is supposed to work.
In the distance, approaching at 300
I got Kirkpatrick out here in an hour and a half notice with a camera. They phoned up and said, we're coming, and they got out here just in time.
This is the aircraft's last flight. From Abbotsford, it makes a low-level pass over Victoria Airport.
I think it's one of the fastest twin-engine bombers in the world,
Con Air
too.
doesn't use A-26s anymore, but rather less expensive, more maneuverable tracker aircraft. Over the years, Con Air has donated its entire fleet of Douglas A-26s to museums around the world. This is the last one. It was built in 1943 in California. It fought in World War II, the Korean conflict, and in Vietnam. Some say it's still the fastest piston twin-engine driven attack bomber ever made. Its 2 engines developed 2,000 horsepower each. While fighting forest fires, it carried 800 gallons of fire retardant at a time. But its fighting days in 3 wars and protecting BC's timber are over. For Pat Phillips, this is a big day. Will you ever be flying it again?
I doubt it. The airplane has been sent over here, donated to us, and we're going to put it on display as a museum piece. And it's not the most easy airplane to maintain. And it's old, and it's time it was put away and arrested, and that's what we're planning to do.
The A-26, known as the Invader, has invaded a patch of grass at Victoria Airport. An expensive gift. They cost, if you can find one, up to $200,000 in the States. The BC Aviation Museum is expecting another big gift this Sunday, as BC Finance Minister Malcolm Willier is expected to make a major funding announcement. A double victory for the history of flight in a museum that was only built this spring, a museum moving forward by stepping back.
Now that's good press. Okay, so the construction continues. This is Jim's invention. He invented these doors, invented the big pulleys at the bottom. That was Jimmy's idea. A couple of more shots of the door going up. This is the gravel floor before we got concrete. I think we had to wait for another draw or that next money they're talking about they were supposed to get. This is the sign going on the front. It had floats on it in that airplane, but they mysteriously disappeared. I won't say anything about that. Okay, I'm in the coffee shop one morning at the Flying Club having the usual meeting with all the people, and Joe House, who's Russ's partner at Victoria Air Base, says there's an Aceman flying boat going to the Duncan dump this morning. So you better get up there and see what they got. So I called my boss and he gave me a day off. They were very supportive of the museum. And David and I got in the pickup truck, went up there. And when we got there, the guy had already been to the dump with one load. Now there's the barn at Quamachin Lake. There's the engine cover. This is the tail feathers. But there was so much crap in the barn, it was hard to tell what belonged to an airplane and what was just junk. But we headed off the dump because the guy said, I just took a whole bunch of stuff there. This is still sorting through it. This is what we actually found between the dump trip and what was in the barn. These are the spars, some of them. These are the wing floats. This is what we sent the picture of at the Smithsonian, and they identified it as an Eastman flying boat. There's the famous rib right there. That's the only rib we got, so they knew the profile of the wing. Cockpit cover, engine stuff, engine stand. And there's the layout. There's the stuff we brought back from, part of it from the dump that we'd already caught up. We mocked it all up when we got back to see what we had. And then a lady who had taken her honeymoon in Harrison Hot Springs, we had a news story, another Bruce Kirkpatrick, or the Times called us, I don't know, I told somebody about it. They put it in the paper. She called and said she had a honeymoon in Harrison, and she sent us this picture. So that's the first time we'd ever seen what an Eastman looked like. Now the story was, according to Jim's son, they brought 5 of these from Detroit up to British Columbia, supposedly on a gold mining expedition. It was all bullshit, because I think it was done, as his son told me, that his dad was worried about the Depression. They thought they might go bankrupt, so they wanted to get some of the aircraft out of Detroit. So they flew them to BC on this fairy tale about a gold mining expedition. And these are the 5 aircraft. Jim stayed up here and eventually started the Consolidated Mining Corporation. So, you know, Jim became quite a well-known figure up there. And a lot of the planes, you know, ended up being wrecked. This is a picture of Jim himself in the aircraft. That's a picture his son gave me. And I went over to see his son, who is Jim Jr. And he told me that his father was cooking meat in 1923 with radio waves. And he also had a sign out in front of his shop with a tube with gas in it that lit up at nighttime. So he might have invented the neon sign and the microwave, I don't know. There's his grave. And the reason Jim died was because he had a bleeding ulcer, and the only person that could fly the airplane out of Atlanta was him. So he was the Mercy pilot, and nobody could take him to the hospital, so he passed away. We mocked it up at our first open house to show people what we had, got some more buzz going, trying to find out where the rest of the stuff, and it started coming in. Bertie Larondel, who's over here at Nav Air, comes over and he says, my father-in-law's got one of the hulls of that thing on his farm in Fort St. John. So that's how we got the front end of the Eastman. Still had the rudder pedals in it. This is coming back from Camosun College. The Camosun College first sheet metal class actually built the tail end for us behind the cockpit. We only got this part initially from here up. This was all added on by Camosun. We had this top part they found in the barn, and it had the compartment markings, so they knew what the dimensions were. The wheel and the yoke came from a couple in Victoria. I don't know where they got it from. The engine is a Curtis Challenger, which is actually a 6-cylinder radio, but it's not because you can't have an even number, so it's actually 2 rows of 3. This is a Curtis Challenger engine. This was used on the Curtis Robin, which is the one that set the endurance record. Remember the area refueling back in the 30s? That's what they were flying. And that Curtis guy, by the way, this is another George Watt story. Curtis, that engine was owned by the guy that was at Wrongway Corrigan, whatever his name was. He owned this Curtis Robin. He was the longest owner of a Curtis product in history at that time, was that. He died, and George Watt took his place because he'd had that P-40 for almost 7 years, and it's Curtis built. So. I got a slide from a guy up in Atlanta, and he said that there was one of them built into a boat, and it was at St. Andrews in Winnipeg, along with one of the struts. So when I was out there visiting my sister-in-law, I found this in a barn out there, or a warehouse. Somehow it got out here. Bert Clark showed up. That's him on the ladder. Bert was a Lancaster pilot in Comox. And Bert basically spent, I don't know how many years on this thing. I wasn't around at that time, I'd moved on, but this is some of the restoration shots. There's Bert building the wing. I remember him telling me there was 224 pieces in every one of those ribs that he built. And there's Jim Eastman's son standing there with Bert when they roll it up. So, we get to the opening. Finally going to open the museum. Of course, the finance minister's here. We had the mayors of all 3 municipalities, the airport people, Transport Canada. They were all up on the podium with me. It was a big deal. This gentleman came in, Bruce Baird was a fellow I knew. He says, my uncle Walter's in a rest home in Bellingham, and he wants to come up and see the Norseman. He worked for Bob Nordine. So Walter shows up, and he was Bob's actual engineer on the Norseman. He was in his 90s. And he had 2 stories to tell me when we walked around the airplane. He said, first of all, the other story was, I'll just tell you this. This is Amelia Earhart. Walter was also the chief engineer of the Pitcairn Autogyro Company. That was his first job. And Amelia set the world's altitude record in an autogyro. And Walter actually had film of that, which is gone somewhere. He left us all these 8mm films. So that's a picture of Amelia. I'm just showing this to give you the idea. This angle on the door, it was originally square, and he said when we sold the first 6 to Canadian Airways, the first thing that happened is they called up and they said they couldn't get a barrel of fuel through the door. So he had to redesign the door. And to go back to Ottawa 2 more times for approval. But they did that. And the other thing they did, he talked about this quite a bit, these oleos, they're massive on this airplane with a great big knuckle at the top. He said, you know why those things are so big? The Canadian government made me do that. And I said, well, why? And he said, well, these guys go up into the north at night, and I don't know what they're doing, but they spend the night up there. And they're flying these little dinky-ass Fairchilds, he said, and they sit there with these skis and they freeze on the lake. So they get up in the morning, the thing's stuck on the ice, so they go and they jump on the tail feathers, they jump up and down and they snap the oleo off. So the RCAF has to send a rescue plane in, and Ottawa's getting fed up doing that. So if you're going to build a new bush plane, you better make it strong enough that they can't do that. He said he went back to Ottawa 3 times before he had it tough enough. So that's the story of that. And of course, I thought it was only fitting that Walter Clayton cut the ribbon on the BC Aviation Museum, so that's why he's in the picture. There's the finished product. The flag. I said to Jimmy, we got to have a flag for the opening. And there was a flagpole laying in the Transport Canada yard over here. Now, we were a bit of a scrounger group, I must admit. But anyway, I talked to Mike Smith, who was the supervisor system. He borrowed the flagpole for the opening. He said, yeah, sure, okay. So we dragged this huge flagpole over. I said to Jim, set this thing up for the opening tomorrow, because I'm running around trying to organize everything. He said, yeah, it'll get done. I came back the next morning, the thing's in the ground with 10 yards of concrete around it. You know that wind vane you got out front? That's the flagpole. Every time I saw the airport manager, when am I getting my flagpole back? Well, that's 30 years ago. I swear they were calling me Bilko on the airport. Anybody remember Sergeant Bilko? He said, get him out of my office. So that's opening day. Everybody was there, I guess, that needed to be there. And that's pretty much it. I just want to say, I think what you've done with the place is great. It just looks great. I mean, I've been around a little bit over the years, but not totally involved. Maybe I'll do that one of these days. But I was privileged to be here when it started. It was a privilege to be the first president, and it's an honor to stand here tonight in this room and talk to you guys again about where we've come from. And I just wish you all well in the future. Thank you.
Todd doesn't know it, but he's agreed to take some questions, so.
Oh yeah, any questions?
Anybody have any questions?
The front, the roof at the front, where there's a piece kind of missing. What was the rationale for that?
For that blue part?
Yeah.
That was Jimmy's idea. I think we were going to bolt the nose and the Mars on there. There's a spare nose for the Mars.
Okay, yeah.
I went up and looked at it. We couldn't get it under the overpass. But they have a spare nose from the one that was damaged in the hurricane. So they had 2 wings and a nose. I said, well, let's just get the nose and build it on the front. So he beefed it up so that we could hang a nose on it. That never happened. Never know, you might get it again. You know? I mean, there was a lot of of people pulling for this place, not just us. I mean, Jim Orderick was marvelous. He was instigated. I had lunch with Colin Campbell, another guy that I knew who was director of the Heritage Trust. I met him at a museum convention and told him about the Eastman story, and I got $20,000 out of the Heritage Trust. Because he thought it was because it's a great story. I mean, it was in the paper, and you just got to get people excited about what you're doing. It's amazing who comes out of the woodwork to help you. And we sure had some help. And you're still getting it.
You did a magnificent job.
Well, it wasn't alone. But yeah, it was, like I said, it was in the right place at the right time. If Bruce hadn't talked me into taking a flying lesson, just nothing would have happened. It's just, you make a decision in your life to do one thing and you end up doing it completely. He mentioned the poetry. I'm only going to say this because, if you don't blow your own horn, nobody else will. My poem, Flyer's Prayer, which is known worldwide, is used at funerals all over the world. It didn't replace High Flight, but it's been translated into 3 or 4 languages. And it's in Dan Dempsey's book. It's on the Snowbirds memorial page for the ones that crashed. And I just got a request from the United States Navy. This is just a total honor for me, from the test pilot school in Maryland. They're doing a story on the test pilots, the people that have crashed and lost their lives, and they want to use Flyer's Prayer in their book on their memorial page. So I figure the U.S. Navy arrived, I've arrived. I'm famous. Anyway, thank you. Any more questions?
Well, Pat, as you remember...
Not another tie.
As you remember, one time I did call you the founding father. Yes. And I think you showed here why that is an appropriate title, because it took a lot to bring a diverse group with different aims, different objectives, and very little money and no resources to come together and to unify and to move on and to get things done. And I know we've talked privately, and running up the personal line of credit and lots of other things that you did that had to be done to get this place onto its feet. You did that. And I think that we who've carried on and have come later need to know those stories, and we need to know the people who got us where we are today in large part, and we had the easy part. We get to carry it forward, but somebody had to get it going, somebody had to get it done. And I heard you say, it was a great thing here, we got the right people at the right place at the right time, and I can think of no better example of that than yourself. And so as a reward, we have this traditional gift of fermented grape juice.
Wonderful.
And we thank you so much for coming out tonight to tell us that story.
I just had one thing he mentioned when we were doing things that we had to do. When this thing was all finished, I still owe Jimmy McLaren $60,000 for these annexes. They hadn't paid it back, and I made him a promise I wouldn't leave the museum until he was paid back. And it was in my 6th year, and I was burning out, and it was time. I'm at the bank Christmas party for Post Capital, sitting across from the loans manager. He asked me how the museum's going. I said, well, really good, but I said, do you think you could loan me $60,000 if I put up a World War II bomber for collateral? He says, how much is it worth? I says, I just wrote a receipt for 125 grand, and they did. They actually lent us the $60,000 on the 826, and we paid Jimmy back. That's how it happened.